I've always been the type to enjoy solitude, especially out in nature. There's just something about being alone in the wilderness. The quiet, the isolation. It's like a reset for my mind. So, a few years ago, I decided to take a solo camping trip up in northern Utah. I'd been up there a couple of times with friends, but this time I wanted to go it alone. 3 nights in the woods, just me, my hammock, and whatever peace I could find. The first 2 nights were exactly what I'd hoped for. I hiked during the day, found a great spot by a small creek, and spent my evenings by the fire, watching the stars. It was everything I needed. But that 3rd night, well, it turned out to be something I'll never forget. I'd gone to bed pretty early, all bundled up in my hammock with my tarp above me in case it rained. I remember waking up around 2 a.m., feeling like I needed to take a piss. I tried to ignore it, but you know how that goes. Eventually, I gave up, grabbed my boots, and climbed out. I didn't even bother with my headlamp, just walked about 10 feet away from my campsite, figuring I'd be back in bed in no time. But then I saw it. Off in the distance, maybe 80, 100 feet away, there was this faint light. A headlamp, just hovering there in the darkness. I froze mid-pee and just stared at it. It wasn't moving, just this single small light in the middle of the woods. My mind started racing. Who the hell else would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? I finished up and stood there for a minute watching. The light didn't move. I felt my heart start to pound a little harder. I told myself it was probably just another camper, someone like me, up for a midnight bathroom break. But then after what felt like forever, the light moved. It flicked up, and I saw the beam hit the trees. Then it shifted down, like whoever it was had stood up. I watched as the figure, because now I could see the outline of a person, sat back down. My first thought was that they were just camping nearby and maybe didn't even realize I was here. But something about the way they were just sitting there not moving was off. I went back to my hammock, grabbed my boots and my hatchet, because who goes out into the woods alone without some sort of protection, right? And decided to get a better look. I moved to the right of my campsite, staying low, trying to be as quiet as possible. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I could just make out the shapes of the trees and bushes around me. I got about 50 yards from my site and started angling toward where I'd seen the light. I was still trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then I saw another headlamp. This one was closer, maybe 40 feet away, bobbing around like whoever had it was looking for something. I hit the ground, my heart in my throat. The guy was walking around, shining his light on the ground like he was searching for something, or someone. I threw some leaves over me and lay there, holding my breath as he got closer. He was maybe 10 feet away when he stopped, lit a cigarette, and just stood there. I could see the orange glow of the cigarette in the darkness, hear the soft crackle as he took a drag. He was so close I could hear him breathing, and all I could think was, what the hell is going on? He didn't look like a camper. His clothes were too dark, too clean. He had a beer can in his hand, and after a few more drags on his cigarette, he tossed the can on the ground and started walking away. I waited until I was sure he was far enough that he wouldn't hear me, and then I started to move. I figured I'd circle back and try to get closer to the first guy, see what he was up to. Maybe he was just drunk and lost, or maybe they were both just idiots who'd stumbled onto my campsite by accident. Either way, I needed to know what was going on. I crept closer, moving as quietly as I could, keeping low to the ground. I could see the first guy now, his headlamp casting a faint glow around him. I got close enough to hear his phone buzzing. He kept checking it like he was waiting for a message or something. I moved a little closer, close enough to see his face lit up by the glow of the screen. He was just sitting there, staring at his phone, looking tense. Then he stood up, turned off his headlamp, and started walking, straight toward my hammock. I lay there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I was torn between wanting to get up and confront him and just staying put, hoping he wouldn't notice me. But he was heading right for my campsite, and I knew I couldn't just let him go through my stuff. I waited until he was about halfway there and then started moving back toward my site, staying low, trying not to make a sound. When I got close enough to see what was happening, I froze. There were flashlights all around my campsite, moving back and forth. I could see at least 3 or 4 people, rummaging through my things, tossing stuff around. I heard one of them say, "He was just here," and my stomach dropped. They knew I was around. They were looking for me. My hammock was slashed, my tarp ripped down, my mess kit was scattered all over the ground, and someone was shining my big flashlight, the one I kept in my pack, into the trees. I don't know how long I lay there watching them destroy my campsite, listening to them talk about me like I was some animal they were hunting. I could hear them laughing, joking about how I must have run off scared, how they'd taught me a lesson. I just kept thinking, don't move, don't breathe, just wait. Finally, after what felt like hours, they started to leave. I watched my flashlight get smaller and smaller as they walked away, my heart still pounding, my hands shaking. I waited until I couldn't see the light anymore, until everything was quiet again, and then I waited some more. When the sun finally started to rise, I got up, my whole body stiff and aching. I crept back to my campsite, half expecting to see them still there, but it was empty. My hammock was shredded, my tarp hanging in pieces. They'd taken my backpack, my rain gear, my flashlight. All my food was gone, my mess kit stomped into the ground. I stood there looking at the mess they'd made, feeling this weird mix of relief and anger. Relief that they were gone, that I was okay. Anger that they'd done this, that they'd turned what was supposed to be this peaceful, solitary experience into something dark and twisted. I walked back to where I'd seen the first guy and found a bunch of empty beer cans and some chew pouches. There was an empty lighter, too, just lying there in the dirt. I walked over to where the second guy had been and found a mess of cigarette butts and an empty bag of powder, probably meth. There was a pile of crap nearby, just out in the open, no toilet paper or anything. It was disgusting, and it just made me feel even more violated. I didn't stick around much longer after that. I packed up what I could, left the rest, and hiked out as fast as I could. I didn't see them again, but I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, half expecting them to come back to finish whatever they'd started. I haven't been back to that spot since. I still go camping, but I'm a lot more careful now. I don't go alone anymore, and I never camp without some kind of protection. I learned my lesson that night. You think you're alone out there, that you're safe in the quiet of the woods, but you never really know who or what might be watching. It was probably mid-fall 2018, and my husband and I decided to take a camping trip to Boysen Reservoir in Wyoming. We'd heard great things about the place, and after being cooped up for so long, we just wanted to get away from everything and everyone. We got super lucky and managed to book one of those beachfront sites right there on the water, away from all the other campers. At the time, it sounded like the perfect escape. I mean, who wouldn't want to camp out under the stars with nothing but the sound of water lapping against the shore? But if you've ever been to Wyoming, you know how isolated it can be. It's beautiful during the day, all wide open spaces and endless skies. But once the sun goes down, it's a whole different vibe. The darkness out there is something else, like the kind of pitch black that swallows up everything. And the silence? It's almost oppressive. No bugs chirping, no distant hum of traffic, just dead, eerie quiet. We set up camp, got a fire going, and just sat there, enjoying the peace and quiet. It was almost surreal, sitting there with my husband, watching the flames dance, and feeling like we had the whole world to ourselves. But that feeling didn't last long. It must have been around 10 p.m. We were just finishing up some s'mores when we heard a car coming down the dirt road leading to our campsite. At first, we didn't think much of it, figured it was just someone who'd taken a wrong turn. But then the car, this big SUV with blacked-out windows, pulled right into our campsite. My husband stood up, waving his hand in a friendly way like, "Hey, you lost? Need directions?" But the SUV didn't stop. It just kept rolling forward, slowly, almost like it was sizing us up. It drove right past us down to the beach and just sat there, engine idling. I glanced over at my husband and I could see it in his eyes. Something wasn't right. We were way too far off the beaten path for this to be a coincidence. He didn't say anything at first, just kept his eyes on the SUV. After what felt like forever, the car finally turned around and drove back up the road the way it came. "That was weird," I said, trying to brush it off, but my stomach was doing somersaults. "Yeah, really weird," my husband muttered, still staring at the dark road where the car had disappeared. "I don't like it." We sat there for a minute, just listening to the silence, but it felt different now, like the quiet was pressing in on us, making it hard to think straight. My husband stood up, looked at me and said, "Let's pack up. Now." I didn't argue. Something in his voice told me he wasn't just being paranoid. I started throwing stuff into the car while he kept shining our flashlight down towards the beach, his eyes never leaving the spot where the SUV had parked. I asked him what he was looking for, and he just said, "I think they dropped someone off." That was all I needed to hear. We packed up faster than I've ever packed in my life, just shoving things into the car without any rhyme or reason. The whole time, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched, that someone was out there in the dark just beyond the reach of our flashlight waiting. We finally got everything into the car, jumped in, and slammed the doors shut. My husband turned the key and the engine roared to life. I looked out the window, half expecting to see someone coming towards us, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching out in front of us. We started driving, heading back up the way we came. I was clutching the door handle so tight my knuckles were white, my eyes darting back and forth, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. We were both tense, not saying a word, just focusing on getting out of there. And then out of nowhere, headlights appeared behind us. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was the same SUV barreling down the road, gaining on us fast. "Is that them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My husband didn't even look back. "Yeah, it's them." I could feel the panic rising in my chest. "What do we do?" He glanced at me, his face set and serious. "I have to go fast. Are you okay with that?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Just get us out of here." He floored it, the car lurching forward as we sped down the bumpy, unkept road. I was thrown back against the seat, gripping the armrest for dear life. The headlights behind us were getting closer, bobbing up and down as the SUV tore over the rough ground. We were flying down that road, doing at least 80, maybe more. I could feel every bump, every dip, the car shuddering and swaying as we hit potholes and dodged rocks. My eyes were glued to the road ahead, but I couldn't help glancing back, watching as the SUV got closer and closer. "What do they want?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. "I don't know," my husband said, his voice tight, "but they're not getting it." We hit a stretch of road that curved sharply to the left, the canyon walls looming up on either side. My husband didn't slow down. He took the turn so fast I thought we were going to roll, the tires screeching and gravel flying. I could hear the SUV behind us, the roar of its engine echoing off the canyon walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the SUV fell back. I looked out the rear window, my heart pounding, and watched as the headlights grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared around the bend. We didn't slow down. My husband kept his foot on the gas, pushing the car as fast as it would go. It wasn't until we were miles away, the lights of the nearest town just visible on the horizon, that he finally eased off the pedal. We pulled over at a gas station, both of us shaking, adrenaline still coursing through our veins. We sat there for a minute, not saying anything, just staring straight ahead, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" I finally asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. My husband shook his head, still gripping the steering wheel like he was afraid to let go. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I'm glad we listened to our gut." We never did figure out what those people wanted or why they'd chased us like that. All I know is that we got out of there just in time. I can still see the look in my husband's eyes when he told me to pack up, the way he didn't even hesitate when he saw those headlights behind us. We talk about it sometimes, what might have happened if we'd stayed, if we'd ignored that gut feeling. I don't like to think about it too much. All I know is that we're both here, we're both safe, and I'm never going back to that place again. Wyoming's beautiful, but I'll take my chances with a crowded campsite over isolation any day. Sometimes being alone in the wilderness isn't the dream you think it's going to be. Sometimes it's a nightmare you barely escape. I was around 8 years old when my parents took us camping at this spot they loved deep in the woods. I remember being pretty excited because I'd always been fascinated by the idea of sleeping outside, under the stars, with nothing but the night sky above me. My older sister, on the other hand, wasn't so keen on the whole nature experience and insisted on sleeping inside the tent. But not me. I wanted the real deal. We'd spent the day hiking and fishing, and by the time the sun started to set, I was wiped out. I set up my little cot right next to the tent and lay down with my sleeping bag, feeling like the bravest kid in the world. My sister teased me a bit, saying I'd chicken out and crawl into the tent before midnight, but I just shrugged it off. I was determined to prove her wrong. The air was cool and the sky was so clear I could see what felt like a million stars. It was beautiful, and I remember thinking how amazing it was that I was the only one out of all my friends who was getting to do this. I felt like a little explorer lying there with my head poking out of the sleeping bag, watching the stars twinkle above me. I could hear the soft murmur of my parents talking around the campfire, the crackling of the fire itself and the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze. It was perfect. At some point I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew I was waking up to this strange sound, a kind of snuffling noise like someone trying to sniff out a hidden treasure. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and realized it was still the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing embers, and everything was quiet. Well, almost everything. I felt this warm, heavy breath on my face, and that's when I noticed it. This huge dark shape looming over me. I was still half asleep, and for a second, I thought maybe it was my dad leaning over to check on me. But then I really woke up and my heart just about stopped. It wasn't my dad, it was a bear. A real, honest-to-God bear was standing over me, sniffing my head like it was trying to figure out what I was and whether or not I was worth eating. I was so scared I couldn't even breathe. I just lay there, completely frozen, staring up at this massive creature, my mind racing a million miles an hour. What do you do when you're 8 years old and there's a bear sniffing your head? I had no idea. I'd heard all kinds of things. Play dead, make yourself look big, don't run, but I couldn't do any of that. I was paralyzed, like my body had decided that the best course of action was to turn into a statue and hope the bear would get bored and go away. I could feel its nose brushing against my hair, its breath warm and wet on my skin. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure the bear could hear it. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I die, eaten by a bear on my first real camping trip. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then, just like that, the bear stopped sniffing me and turned away. I didn't move. I just watched as it lumbered over to the picnic table, where we'd left some of our snacks. I could see its big, shadowy shape rummaging around, knocking things over, making a mess. I was still too scared to even blink. My eyes were glued to that bear as it tore into the food we'd stupidly left out. That's when I realized my parents hadn't woken up yet. They were still asleep in the tent, completely oblivious to the fact that a bear was having a midnight snack just a few feet away from them. The bear knocked over a cooler, and the sound must have finally been loud enough to wake them up because I heard my mom's voice, muffled and confused, asking my dad what was going on. I didn't dare say anything. I was too afraid that if I made a sound, the bear would come back and finish what it started. My dad poked his head out of the tent and I could see his silhouette against the dim light from the dying fire. He froze for a second, just like I had, and then I heard him shout, "Hey, get out of here!" He clapped his hands and made this weird growling noise that was supposed to sound like a bigger bear, I guess. It worked, though. The bear paused, looked at him, and then, like it had just lost interest, turned around and lumbered off into the woods. I didn't move until it was completely out of sight. Then, all at once, the fear that had been holding me in place just broke, and I burst into tears. My dad rushed over to me, still looking around to make sure the bear was really gone, and scooped me up in his arms. I was shaking so hard I could barely talk, and I remember clinging to him like I never had before. My mom was right behind him, and I could see the panic in her eyes as she looked me over, checking to make sure I was okay. "I'm fine," I managed to choke out between sobs. It was just It was right here. My dad nodded, holding me close, and for the first time in my life, I saw real fear on his face. He didn't say much, just held me tight and kept glancing back at the tree line where the bear had disappeared. My mom kept whispering that it was okay that the bear was gone, but I could tell she was just as scared as I was. After a few minutes, when I'd calmed down a little, my dad asked if I wanted to move my cot into the tent with my sister. I didn't even hesitate. I just nodded, still holding on to him. There was no way I was going to stay out there under the stars again, no matter how brave I thought I was. He helped me drag my cot inside, and my sister, who'd been half awake and listening to the whole thing, just scooted over and made room for me without a word. I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling her small, warm presence next to me. And for the first time that night, I felt safe. It took a long time to fall asleep, though. Every little sound outside made me jump, and I kept picturing that bear standing over me, its nose inches from my face. I don't think I really slept at all, just lay there with my eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, everything looked so normal. It was hard to believe it had actually happened. My parents were already packing up, and the picnic table was a wreck, with food scattered everywhere. My dad gave me a weak smile and ruffled my hair. "Maybe we should have kept the food in the car, huh?" he joked, but his voice was tight. We left that campsite in record time. I don't think we even had breakfast. My parents didn't say much, and neither did I. It wasn't until we were back in the car, driving away from the woods, that I started to feel normal again, like I could finally breathe. It's been years since that night, and I've gone camping plenty of times since then. I even sleep under the stars sometimes, but only when I'm with other people, and never without double-checking that there's no food left out. But I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, the way it felt to have a bear, an actual bear, sniffing my head. And you know what? To this day, my sister still teases me about it. She'll say, "Hey, remember that time you were almost a bear's midnight snack?" and laugh like it's the funniest thing in the world. I guess it is in a way. I mean, I lived to tell the tale, right? Taking my kids camping for the first time was supposed to be one of those memorable bonding experiences, you know? Roasting marshmallows, telling ghost stories around the campfire, all the classic stuff. They'd been begging me for weeks, and I finally gave in. I thought it would be good for them to get away from screens for a while and experience the great outdoors, or at least the tiny sliver of it we could manage just a few miles from home. I'm not a hardcore camper by any stretch, but I can pitch a tent and start a fire without setting everything around me ablaze, so I figured I was qualified enough. We packed up the car with way more gear than we actually needed, snacks, extra blankets, and of course the s'mores essentials, and headed out to this little spot in the woods not too far from our house. It's a place I'd been to a couple of times before with my wife, but this was the first time taking the kids. They were excited, but also a little on edge. I think it was the idea of being out there, away from the comfort of home, that made them nervous. You know how kids are. One minute they're begging to do something adventurous, and the next they're scared out of their minds because it's not exactly like they imagined. I kept telling them, "There's nothing to worry about. It's just us, the trees, and maybe a couple of squirrels. We'll be fine." We got the tent set up and the fire going just as the sun started to dip below the trees. The kids were finally starting to relax a bit, enjoying their s'mores and even laughing at the stories I was telling them. I was feeling pretty good about myself, like maybe I was actually doing this dad thing right. But then as the fire started to die down and the dark crept in around us, I could see that nervous look creeping back onto their faces. We all know that feeling. The woods take on a whole different vibe once the sun goes down. I tried to keep things light, but I could tell they were getting scared. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. I got the kids into the tent, tucked them into their sleeping bags, and made sure everything was zipped up tight. I could hear them whispering to each other, asking about all the noises outside. "It's just the wind," I kept saying. "Maybe a raccoon or two. Nothing to worry about." I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling pretty satisfied with how the night had gone. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the hoot of an owl somewhere off in the distance. The kids were still whispering, and I knew it was going to take them a while to fall asleep. I told them again that there was nothing out there that could hurt them. "It's just us," I said. "No monsters, no ghosts, just the trees and the stars." And then right after I said it, we heard something moving outside the tent. Not just the wind or a rustling leaf, something big. The kids froze, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer to the tent. The kids started to whimper, and I did my best to stay calm. "Probably just a deer," I whispered, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe even a raccoon. They get curious sometimes." I was half convinced myself, but then we heard it again, closer this time. Whatever it wasn't just passing by, it was right outside. "Dad, what is it?" my youngest asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know, sweetie," I admitted, feeling the first real twinge of fear myself. "But it's nothing to worry about. We're safe in here." But damn was I wrong. What happened next I would have never expected. Something came down on the top of the tent. Not just a bump or a brush, but a full-on push, like someone pressing down with their hands in 4 distinct spots. The fabric caved in under the pressure, and the kids lost it. They were screaming, crying, scrambling to get out of their sleeping bags. I was trying to calm them down, but my own heart was racing, and before I knew it, I let out this ridiculous high-pitched scream. It was pure panic, and for a split second I thought we were all done for. Then I heard the sound again right above us, a thump, followed by the unmistakable sound of a cat meowing. I couldn't believe it. My heart was still pounding as I unzipped the tent and peeked out. And there, sitting on top of the tent looking completely unbothered, was our cat Max. He's this little black and white furball who's usually more of a house cat, but apparently my wife had let him outside that evening, and he'd decided to follow us down to the campsite. I don't know if it was the sight of us all huddled inside the tent or the sound of us freaking out that made him curious, but he jumped right on top, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. He'd never seen a tent before, and I guess he thought it was some kind of weird new plaything. The kids were still crying, and it took me a minute to get them to calm down enough to explain. "It's just Max," I said, trying not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. "It's just the cat, okay? He's not a monster, he's not a ghost, he's just a dumb little cat who wanted to see what we were doing." I got out of the tent and pulled him down, and he just looked up at me like I was the idiot. I brought him inside, and the kids finally stopped crying, but they were still shaking. I was still shaking. I tried to make a joke out of it, saying something like, "Well, I guess Max just wanted to go camping too." But they were having none of it. We didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound had them jumping, and I was right there with them. I kept thinking about how I'd screamed like that, how for just a second I'd been as scared as they were. We ended up packing up and heading home as soon as the sun came up. It's been a few years now, but the kids still bring it up every now and then. They tell the story to their friends, always ending with how Daddy screamed like a baby. It's embarrassing, but I guess it's kind of funny, looking back now. You know, looking back, it's one of those, what the hell were we thinking moments that still makes me cringe. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea. It was supposed to be one of those epic camping trips. Just me and a couple of buddies, a cooler full of beer, and nothing but the wild to keep us company. We'd picked this spot way out in the wilderness, miles from any town, just to get away from it all and have a few laughs. The first couple of days were great. We hiked, we fished, and of course we drank. By the third night, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves, like we were these rugged outdoorsmen living off the land. In reality, we were just 3 idiots with too much alcohol and not enough common sense. That night, the moon was huge and bright, lighting up the whole forest around us. I don't know whose idea it was, probably Dave's, but someone suggested we start howling at the moon. You know, like wolves or something. And being the responsible adults we are, we all thought it was hilarious. So there we were, 3 grown men, stumbling around our campsite, howling like maniacs. It probably went on for a good 15 minutes, maybe more. We were laughing so hard we could barely breathe. I remember leaning against a tree, holding my stomach because it hurt from all the laughing. We were making enough noise to wake the dead, and I'm pretty sure every animal within a 10-mile radius was giving us a wide berth. Eventually we calmed down, the adrenaline wearing off, and the cold night air starting to sober us up. We decided to call it a night and climbed into our hammocks. It was one of those perfect nights for sleeping outside, not too cold, and the stars were out in full force. I remember thinking how lucky we were to be out there, away from everything, with nothing but the sounds of the forest around us. But then, about an hour later, I woke up. I don't know what it was at first, maybe a twig snapping, or maybe I just sensed something was off. I lay there, still half asleep, listening. The fire had died down to just a few glowing embers, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. And then I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart started to race, and I strained to see in the dim light. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees around us, and for a moment I thought it was just my imagination. But then the rustling got louder, and I saw them. Wolves. Real, honest-to-God wolves slinking into our campsite like shadows. There were at least 4 or 5 of them, maybe more. It was hard to tell in the dark. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I lay there in my hammock, barely daring to breathe, watching as they moved closer. They were sniffing around, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. I could see the glint of their teeth, the way their ears twitched, listening for any sound. They looked huge, way bigger than I'd imagined, and terrifying. My mind was racing, trying to remember everything I knew about wolves, which, as it turns out, wasn't much. Don't move, don't make a sound. That's all I could think. I glanced over at Dave and Mike, who were in their hammocks a few feet away. They were both awake, and from the way they were lying there, stiff as boards, I could tell they were just as scared as I was. I don't know if they'd seen the wolves yet, but they definitely heard them. One of the wolves walked right up to the fire pit and started sniffing around, probably looking for food. My mouth was dry as sandpaper, and I was desperately hoping it wouldn't find anything interesting. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, 2 of the wolves started growling at each other, low and guttural. My stomach dropped. I couldn't see what they were fighting over, but I could hear their teeth snapping, and the sound made my blood run cold. I just lay there, every muscle in my body tense, watching as these 2 wolves squared off. Their growls turned into snarls, and then they lunged at each other. It was all teeth and fur and rage, and I thought, this is it. They're going to finish fighting, and then they're going to come for us. But after a few seconds, they broke apart, still growling, circling each other. I could see their breath in the cold air, and the sound of their growls echoed in the silence. They seemed more frustrated than anything, and I guess whatever they were fighting over wasn't worth it. Because they stopped, sniffed around a bit more, and then just wandered off. The rest of the pack followed them, slipping back into the shadows like ghosts. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring up at the sky, my heart pounding in my ears. I kept expecting them to come back, to feel the cold nose of a wolf sniffing at my hammock, but nothing happened. The forest was quiet again, like it had been holding its breath and finally let it out. It felt like hours before any of us moved. Finally, I heard Dave whisper, "You guys okay?" "Yeah," Mike breathed, his voice shaking. "You?" "Barely," I muttered, trying to keep my voice from cracking. We didn't say much after that, just lay there staring up at the sky, too scared to even think about sleeping. I kept going over the night in my head, remembering the wolves, the way they'd looked at us like we were just another part of the forest. I was terrified, but also kind of amazed that they'd come so close. In the morning, when the sun finally started to rise, we crawled out of our hammocks, stiff and exhausted. There were tracks all around the campsite, and the ground was torn up where the wolves had been fighting. It was surreal, like something out of a movie. We packed up pretty quick after that, not saying much. I think we were all still trying to process what had happened. We didn't even bother with breakfast, just threw everything in our packs and hiked out of there as fast as we could. It wasn't until we were back in the car driving away that we finally started to talk about it. "Did that really happen?" Dave asked, shaking his head. "Were those wolves really here?" "Yeah," I said, my voice still a little shaky. "They were here." Mike just laughed, this kind of disbelieving, nervous laugh. "Man, we're lucky. We're so damn lucky." And he was right. I don't know why the wolves didn't attack us. Maybe they weren't that hungry, or maybe they just didn't see us as a threat. But whatever the reason, we dodged a bullet, and I knew it. We stopped for breakfast at this diner a few towns over, and while we were eating, Dave looked at me and said, "No more howling at the moon, okay?" I laughed, but it was more of a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, no more howling. I think we've learned our lesson." It's funny now looking back. It's one of those stories we tell when we get together, about that time we almost got eaten by wolves. But even now, I can still remember the way they looked, the sound of their growls. It's a good reminder, I guess, that no matter how tough you think you are, the wild doesn't care.